Matt.
Good morning.
We're live. All right.
Actually, Caitlin, can you pause until we go live? All right, you good? Here we go.
Yep. Do you want to bring up the agenda? I don't know if I
Sure thing.
quickly search it.
Okay. The webinar is now live.
Well, welcome everybody. This is, I think, second to last meeting. We've got one more in January. We'll talk about it here shortly. We kind of wrap up our little journey together in the HPAC during the 2023 season. I'm going to head and turn it over to, well, let's see. I guess we just really have the one agenda item, just to really kind of ratify. Sorry, what's that? Oh, I don't know. Okay. So our major focus today is just ratifying the HPAC recommendations and the process by which we kind of carried these out over the year. Matt, do you want to talk quickly about kind of the background and purpose of what we kind of went through the last week or so, giving people an opportunity to review and take a look at all their vote history?
Sure thing. So, just given the volume of recommendations that the council, the work groups had moved forward to the council over the past 10 months and 9-10 months, and the fact that all of the recommendations, when they did come to the council through the 3-reading process, were preliminarily adopted, and that there would need to be a final decision by the council. The co-chairs, Co-Chair Hall, Co-Chair Tevi, wanted to provide an opportunity based off some feedback from some other council members to ensure that members had the opportunity to reflect on the positions they had taken during the preliminary adoption of any of the recommendations through the council meetings, as well as to the extent that folks were not able to participate in one of the 3 readings of each of the recommendations, or were not able to be present for the 3rd reading when the vote occurred, that folks could get their perspective on the various recommendations, either update them or get them on the record. Now, to be clear, there's no retroactive voting on the preliminary votes. It's simply an opportunity that the co-chairs wanted to provide so that people could have their feedback on that reflected in the final report. We did not have any council members contact me asking to update their position from one of their positions on the preliminarily adopted recommendations. Director Bateman did have to miss the November 3rd meeting, where a number of recommendations were considered due to a conflicting Land Conservation and Development Commission meeting that her agency is responsible for staffing. And so she wanted to make sure she got those positions on the record. So I emailed those out to you all today. Those will be included in the final report. As I said, it's not a retroactive vote. It's just a narrative narrative overview for the record, so folks can have that on. And then Councilmember Madsen also shared some thoughts around the original plan framework and prioritization, and specifically the criteria around racial equity and racial justice. And so that was also included in the email I sent out to you this morning. So that is where we've been over the last about week and a half, myself, and then working to support the co-chairs and moving this to this meeting for the ratification consideration. So I'll pass that back to you, Co-Chair Tevi.
Okay, great. Is there anything you wanted to add, Damien, on our conversations? And I think it's been a really good conversation over the last week. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Damien if you have anything.
Yeah, I appreciate the rundown, Matthew, and it's really just sort of how do we kind of land this? We've done a whole lot of good work. We've got 59 recommendations. We know there's going to be some amount of compiling and graphic design as an element, but we've set our recommendations were preliminary in nature, pardon me, and how do we get everybody to kind of come together and say, hey, this is our body of work, and we've used the word ratify a couple of times here, but really how do we turn the preliminary recommendations into the final approved body of work by the HPAC without going back and revoting 59 times on different things, because that doesn't seem practical, and that's not how we want to use our time today. So, you saw the agenda. We've got really just one agenda item, and would be open to an up and down vote. Just vote once on ratification. But if there are any items that folks would like to talk about, we have time baked in for that. This could potentially be a short meeting. This could potentially be a long meeting, but wanted to take the temperature of the group and see what folks had the opportunity to do, but also give you the opportunity to raise any items in the week leading up to the meeting as well. So that's why the process that Matthew just discussed. So that's sort of where we're at. Just trying to get through to this ratification. I think we're encouraged by the fact that folks didn't send a lot of changing of positions and stood by the positions they took, and appreciated the ratification, or pardon me, appreciated the process. I see Tom, you got your hand up, and then Senator Anderson, you had your hand up for a second, and then let's go Tom, and then Senator Anderson.
Good morning. It's great to see everybody. I seeing the work in Matthew's summary that he sent through last week is just terrific. And, obviously a lot of people have worked a lot of hours. This has been a great process. Would it be possible to do kind of if nobody has changed their position potentially, and I understand some people may have, but not articulated that yet in any form, but could we just, preserve the vote that we had previously and then ratify, en masse with the kind of footnote that anybody who was a no, it remains a no. Anybody who was an abstain, it remains an abstain. Anybody who was a yes, it remains a yes. And because all of them were indeed carried forward, and the balance of power was in yes to get them to this point, then that would preserve the record, I think, of people's personal opinions that got us to where we are today.
Yeah, correct. And I think that's the intention, is that we'd have a single up or down vote for the entirety of it, for the process, and ratifying the process, and kind of acknowledging that each of these had an opportunity to be brought forth. They went through the 3-tier process. They were reviewed. SMEs had an opportunity. There was some, community outreach, but then also recognizing that there's next steps to this entire process. And I think I'm going to maybe preempt some questions. I know after this agenda item, there's what happens next? And so I think that might be where a lot of questions are going to be coming from, is actually what happens next. That might, help smooth or help, kind of solve people's questions about what we're doing right now. And so I don't know if maybe take a chair's prerogative and ask Matt to kind of talk about what happens next as part of this process before we kind of go into a vote. I don't know if we kind of upend the agenda a little bit in order to do that. But I'm just gonna guess that that's where probably some of our questions are going to be coming from, is what's happening next. Alyssa?
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of elevate the question that Joel asked and that Matt sent out to us earlier today, just in terms of, before we ratify the whole framework and, what we just discussed in terms of sort of putting together the final package. It does seem like we had a conversation at the beginning of the process and then somewhere in the middle of the process about how we'll apply a racial equity lens, or basically use some kind of, analytical approach to prioritization based on racial equity impacts. And before we get into what happens next, I wonder if we could talk about sort of how we might put that part of the package together, because I imagine it affects implementation. So things that go forward legislatively might have one approach, things that go forward administratively or programmatically might have different approaches. So where are we with sort of applying the racial equity approach to this package?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that dovetails with also the next step. So I'm going to lean on Matt and JD to fill in what I miss in the summary, but I'm just going to say each of the steps that we've done to apply a racial justice lens, and then what's coming forward once we have a final report and there's review of the final report type situation. So, from the beginning, that's kind of been part of what's baked into expressly into the executive order that created HVAC is that, the racial justice should be one of the considerations when creating these recommendations and doing our work. And so that's one of the things that the co-chairs have been saying, hey, how do we go about doing that? In a group that is meeting online and there's, 27 of us and we have a really tight timeline and we have a whole bunch of different worldviews. How do we align everybody on what is the analysis and what are the, racial justice related impacts of any given recommendation? I know some folks have more experience or less experience creating and applying that type of a lens. But usually it's a pretty involved process on the front end that, has baked into it a whole lot of, shared experience and understanding and objectives that really kind of, are difficult in this format to do in a traditional way. So we said, well, let's bring, like anything else, like the recommendations, let's bring in the experts. So, and this is where I'm going to need your help, Matthew. We brought in the governor's director of racial equity, and I believe that's the job title, and her name is escaping me at the moment. So we sat down, we being Matthew and JD and myself, and said, hey, how do we do this in a way that's meaningful but also practical, right? And so practical and achievable. And so you may have noticed that there were a number of different revisions to the initial kind of form for the creation of the recommendations. So we got feedback from the governor's equity director, and we baked that into the actual forms that the work groups were using to create the recommendations. So without having a whole section that called out racial equity, and without saying, we have some consensus on all of the exact impacts that we're trying to hit, we built that in there in a way that everybody responded to in the working group process. So it wasn't just one question or one box, but I think we had added to 3 or 4 of those kind of prompts about unintended consequences and who's going to be impacted in different things. It was baked in a less direct way. So that we did that, and then have held that throughout as one of the points of feedback and potential comparison that we have for each and every recommendation. And then Matthew, we started talking about halfway through about, well, that's well and good, but how do we do more and continue to rely on the resources available to us to really kind of highlight that lens and apply that lens as far as racial justice goes and racial equity. And so what we landed on was some review and some conversation with a couple of groups. Matthew, I'm not going to be able to come up with the name of the groups, but I believe that there's a committee for racial justice that has a housing subcommittee. Is that right, at the state level? Okay, so they have set aside time in Q1 to take a look at and review and comment on the recommendations and the work coming out of HPAC. And then, Matthew, did we talk to Alan and I'm blanking on what the housing, Alan Laszlo and the housing folks? What was
Fair
the
Housing Council of Oregon.
Say that again.
Alan Laza from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, although he's retired now, but
Okay.
engaging with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, yes.
Okay, and the Fair Housing Council of Oregon as well, and the plan is that they also are going to be providing review and comment. Is that right, Matt? Or did we get both of them?
No, that's correct. So I guess for the full council members, the co-chairs have talked about how to, those front end pieces and the changes to the form in terms of assessing the recommendations, but also ensuring that the back end pieces before the governor decides which of the recommendations she may or may not move forward. As Co-Chair Hall had said, both engage with the Governor's Racial Justice Council and any appropriate committees, as well as some outside key expert organizations like the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and others, to get an assessment, independent assessment of both which of the recommendations may raise concerns around unintended impacts, as well as which would help to advance racial equity and racial justice.
All right. Thank you, Matt. And then I'd also just thought the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, if everybody remembers all the way back to what may have been our first meeting in March, started with the kind of level setting presentation about the work that they do and the racial implications of housing and how it's built and how it is operated in the state of Oregon. So all that together is what we've done to address equity as charged by the executive order. So that is the answer to the question of what have we done and what do we plan to do. And if there's follow-up, I leave it to y'all to ask questions, express any concerns, any ideas. If you'd like something different to happen, now's the time.
And I'll just add to that a theme that we've kind of expressed throughout this entire process is this is just part of the process. This isn't the end. We only have the charge of making recommendations to the governor. That's the extent of our recommendations, extent of our obligation. And where it gets carried on beyond that, I mean, we do everything we can, obviously, into the process, but then there's going to be a lot of review, and the next steps is when it goes into either administrative rules or goes through directives through executive orders, or whether it gets passed off through the legislative process. I think there's going to be another set of processes for each one of these recommendations to be vetted and kind of processed. I almost said meat grinder, but more of a process. So, but I do think I think we've made a really good stab at it. I mean, that was one of the reasons why we wanted to have that thought put into each one of the recommendations. So each of the recommendation forms does have that information on there, unintended consequences and, kind of everyone's thoughts on how to actually be thoughtful of racial and even economic equity and regional equity. So I'm feeling very confident about the process that we've gone through. I think how it comes out in the final document, I think is going to be a kind of a bigger question. Is it buried into the final appendices or is it put up front? Obviously we'll try to make it involved and explained and detailed throughout the entire document, however that document gets finalized. So are there any other questions to the process? And again, I'll maybe I don't know if Matt, if we want to go ahead and jump forward a little bit and just talk about what the next step is on the document and what's going to be happening, especially between now and the middle of January. Alyssa, go ahead if you have another question.
I just wanted to follow up on, thank you for answering the question. And, as we're talking about sort of like a final ratification or whatever we're calling this package of the 59, I think we probably just need to recognize that the racial equity tool, right? The questions that were in each of the forms that we filled out and the recommendations that we made, it was applied, I would say, unevenly, right? And frankly, some of the recommendations really lent themselves to this focus, and some were more, they didn't really lend themselves when they're just pure financial tools or things like that. But I wouldn't say that all 59 of our recommendations had the racial equity lens equally applied. And, some more than others. And so as I vote for the full package, which of course I'm going to do, I think it is important for us to just realize that, like I've been saying all along, this process was a bit of an improvisation along the way, right? We've been kind of making it up as we've been going along a little bit. And so I do think it's just something that we might want to, like you said, JD, whether we bring it to the front of the package or we put it in the appendix, to acknowledge that we had a process, we applied it, but it didn't apply equally and evenly throughout every single recommendation, I guess is how I would say that.
Well, and I'll take that one step further. That is, as people who are working in the trenches, it's really easy to kind of get, I don't want to say myopic, but really that this idea is really, really good. and you get so close to it, it's hard for somebody to step away from it to see how it could be terrible or bad. And so I think that's a, you know, for a specific group or for a specific element of the organization or through the state. And so I think we did a really good job for those things that were kind of clearly impactful. And obviously we'll try and highlight those. But I do think as this is kind of a process, it's almost like we're the worst ones to be looking at this with that lens. I think in some ways this almost makes it a benefit that other people are going to be looking at it with that lens to kind of critique our work on how well we did it, you know, innately. So again, I think this is just part of the process, and so I don't want to grind ourselves apart on hypotheticals, and we just be open to the fact that we'll take criticism from others on how well we did. Joel?
Thank you, Coach Tubby and Alyssa. I agree with your sentiment and comments. I also and really appreciate Coach Hall and Coach Tubby talking through and reminding us of the process, and also the other tools that are, you know, in committees and reviews that we're anticipating as part of this process. And I just encourage us to include that in this report, right, and explicitly call that out. I also think there's an opportunity for like our legislative members and department heads to be chiming in a bit, because I know, like, for example, at OHGS, you know, they're leading, I would say, among state agencies with applying race equity in a lot of their work. And so, you know, in addition to Racial Justice Council, Fair Housing Council of Oregon, like, I think it's important we acknowledge the role and responsibility of the implementing agencies in applying that race equity lens as part of it too. And I'd like to see that, you know, recommendation, I guess, part of coming out of this report, almost expectation, I guess, for us in that. So thank you again for talking through the added steps and kind of the behind the scenes work that's happening, and for bringing this forward.
Mr. Olson.
Yeah, I guess the one kind of additional piece of relevant information from, you know, all of us that have been in the trenches working sort of myopically on all these various recommendations. And I think a valuable thing that we could sort of pass on would be, and I know we've ranked the various recommendations in terms of, you know, how they're going to impact affordability and production. But looking at them as a whole, I think there are some that are incredibly important that sort of rise to the top. And I think some to be able to pass that information on up the chain to make sure that we know there are some that are in there that are, you know, they're relatively or maybe not so important, but there are some things in there that are going to have a huge impact. And if we don't sort of pass that information on and somehow sort of categorize them in a way that the governor ultimately knows and everybody knows what we think are going to be critical for the success of our recommendations, you know, which ones are going to lead to the greatest success, I think we might be leaving that important information sort of unsaid.
Yeah. Good point.
And you know, to that, and Senator Anderson, you're up next. I got you. But you know, we've also been having a conversation about that, right? Like, you know, one of the things that we've, you know, actively tried to avoid during the work group process is prioritizing any given recommendation over another and having a debate about which is the most important, because that didn't seem like the greatest use of our time. We had our hands full with a whole bunch of recommendations. So like, how do we move them forward and optimize them in a way so that we you know, actually have a set target when we can say, oh, hey, here's how we evaluate any particular recommendation, instead of trying to, you know, pit recommendations against each other while we're still moving, creating them and all that type of thing. So we've, again, at the co-chair level, we've been having that conversation. We've reached out to and engaged with the state economist, and what you'll likely see in the next month is some version of, you know, not necessarily prioritizing a list of like, this is number 1 through number 59, but you know, identifying which recommendations have a high, medium, or low level of likely housing production impact, and which recommendations are going to be on a time, if implemented, or would be on a timeline of that impact happening in the short, medium, or long term. And then, a lot of the rest of it, that comes with state level actions is going to be how much consensus can be built around any given concept, or combination of concepts, so that it can actually become law and become implemented. All right, I want to go to Senator Anderson before I see your hand, Deb, but I want to give Senator Anderson an opportunity here.
Well, actually, this last discussion is what I was interested in, so I appreciate Eric bringing it up, and your explanation, it helps. I come from the school of all ideas are worth putting on the table, and I think that's what we've done. But I appreciate the discussion that's folded here of what has perhaps sooner, bigger impact, or impacts that we can get going, because 36,000 units, a run rate of that coming from 20,000 a year is a big jump. And if we don't get started early, we'll never get there. So I would hope that we would, spend some time, categorizing those that may be, quicker, get some action going, and, build up over time. Because I certainly appreciate all 59 of these, but have been trying to go through them and see what might be what I would call low-hanging fruit to get the whole ball started tomorrow rather than 2 years from now. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Anderson, and that's as well put as I think we're going to hear it. But the idea is that part of what I kind of minimized is compilation and graphic design is turning these recommendations into a user-friendly product, right? So that legislatures and other stakeholders can, access the work that we've done and say, hey, here's what's likely to have a quick amount of impact. Here's what's likely to be, more of a political lift, but have a huge amount of impact, and, figure out those trade-offs on the front end. And provide a whole bunch of information that allows folks to really have that kind of detailed and technical conversation, instead of just sort of, the usual, oh, we got to build or we got to preserve, and get into the kind of, the actual implementation, and, build some, hopefully some coalitions around some of these recommendations. So I got Deb and then Daniel.
Good morning, Chair Hall. In regards to using or working with the economists from the state, will there also be an opportunity to have them look at the financial impacts and either appropriate ways to utilize revenue in regards to how to address some of these? I know that early on we had talked about that it wasn't necessarily the council's responsibility to come up with exactly how the revenue is going to be generated, but just to put the recommendations forward. And I think that the financial portion is an important aspect because we know we can't do it all. And so putting that in there as well would be a nice lens.
So I'm going to agree with you in part, and then say that the role of the state economist is not necessarily to recommend the best sources of revenue for any given program or recommendation. Where we kind of got to, just to refresh for folks, was, we set up a number of working groups, one of which was the finance working group, which had a whole bunch of different recommendations, but a good amount of them were things that you would call incentives to build. And then every time you have an incentive, there is the corollary question of where does the money come from, right? And there's really just no way around that. And so did we want to pair the concept of an incentive that could create, be beneficial with a particular source, or do we want to create the incentive and allow the legislature to figure out what an appropriate source is for incentives that they can get behind and build, a political, group around that would support. So what we ended up having is a number of recommendations that look like incentives, and then a number of recommendations that look like that are source focused. If you recall, there's a tax package and there's a couple different packages about how we could in some instances tweak and in some instances completely rework some of the sources of state revenue. So now now kind of context set to specifically answer your question, I don't anticipate that the final report is going to tie the incentives to revenue concepts. I think one way to think about this report is kind of like a menu. We've used that analogy before, kind of like putting out all the ideas on the table and then letting the legislature and the departments and local governments and whomever and the executive branch pick up and choose whichever of the recommendations that they see fit and mix and match and figure out the kind of politics of how to advance any given package or any given recommendation. And I think I see Matt's hand going up, so it's clear you want to say about this, but we have not asked the state economists to do that level of work. All right, so we had Dan, but Matt, I assume you want
I yield to Matt. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share next steps. I know that the co-chairs had asked me to do it a couple of times, but some of our council members wanted to share some thoughts and ask some questions because I think it might be helpful. So, once the HPAC recommendations and report are finalized, that will go to the governor, and she will go, she'll begin her review process with her team. I'm sure it'll include departments. There will be stakeholders involved as well. So there'll be a process by which she's reviewing the recommendations to determine which of the recommendations she's interested in moving forward. Depending on the recommendation, some are much more technical, some have more or less stakeholders or technical experts that need to be involved. There will likely be some a different process depending on the recommendation to ensure the appropriate agencies and technical experts and stakeholders are in the room as things are moved forward. And so I think the guidance I would give to the council overall in finalizing this, and it seems like this is what's kind of circling around in the conversation, I just wanted to state it, is prior to the governor going through her process to review the report and the set of recommendations and make a determination about which she's interested in, pursuing. Is there additional work that needs to be done? And so, Co-Chair Hall gave an example, Co-Chair Tovey gave an example. They both gave examples of, oh yes, we would like to get input from some key organizations and bodies around any either positive outcomes or potential negative outcomes in the context of racial equity and racial justice. And that process should be facilitated. Doesn't need to occur at a HPAC meeting, but can that process be facilitated prior to the governor reviewing it and making that determination? So that's something that they have talked about, and it's something that they've instructed for me to put into that report. The last example was another example also, which was, can you have the state economists review and understanding their very high level recommendations? And so a thorough economic analysis is not possible, but give a general estimate of high, medium, low impact, high, medium, low cost, and time frame. And that should probably occur prior to the governor reviewing to determine which he's interested in moving forward. So the co-chairs have also asked me to make sure that that is clear in the report, either that it is in there or that direction is in there. I've sent over the all the compilation of the preliminarily adopted recommendations to the state economist team, and they're in the process of looking at them. I don't know how much more time they'll need on that. So I think that all this to say, I think that the guidance to the council would be, what additional work does the council itself feel is needed, or the council itself want to do prior to finalizing the recommendation or the report, and what additional key steps should be in there either prior to the governor reviewing them and making her determination, or as a part of the governor reviewing and making her determination. So that can also be in there. You know, we recognize this has been a lot of work. I know the governor appreciates it. I appreciate it. It's been a tight timeline. And so to the extent there is additional work the council itself wants to do, great. And then to the extent there's additional work that needs to happen before or during the governor's review, that can also be flagged. And I think that's what I need as a staff to help you as a council finalize this, is what needs to be really highlighted in the report versus, I think it was Co-Chair Tuvey, versus in an appendix or in a reference point. So I just wanted to share those thoughts.
Thank you, Matt. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, now I have like 3 things to respond to. So I think in reverse order, I'm not sure which order. We talked about prioritization. All the draft recommendations, we'd filled out the matrix about impact, feasibility, and time. There's a great opportunity for a graphic there, and I know that Matt will do that in a way that's easy for someone who's new to this process to digest it. I would also encourage, though, and be totally comfortable with the co-chairs. I presume you're having some sort of executive summary or cover letter or something. If you guys wanted to call out, like, here's the low-hanging fruit, I think that would be very beneficial to a reader of the report. And I think everybody on the committee would trust you to identify, you know, when it's right before the final report going out, things, putting HPAC's name on and say, hey, these are low-hanging fruit items that we would recommend that you look at. I would also, somebody talked, I think it was Eric, about we have this huge body of institutional knowledge that we've built up, and there's no way to ever reduce that all to writing, especially our thought process and deliberations. So I think it would be appropriate if you put in the cover letter, you know, some description that says, hey, this was a quick process, you know, by its nature. These are, you know, conceptual recommendations. To the extent any of them get legs, either in the executive branch or the legislative branch, we are happy to be a resource. If someone's reading a recommendation and they say, what the hell were these guys thinking? How did they possibly arrive at this conclusion? I know, at least for me, and I know the members of the finance committee would be happy to jump on a call and talk it through with a staffer if that was helpful. So I think if you could somehow work that all into a very eloquent cover letter, that would cover a lot of these issues, because we're going to hit a diminishing return trying to shoehorn everything in. So those are my thoughts. And basically my solution is to dump it all on Damien and JD's lap. And I think that's a great end of year way to handle things. So.
Well, in one of our meetings with the governor's office, she did state that, you know, we're probably not really relieved of our charge at the end of the meetings. We got the short session and going into the next year's the long session next year even. And I'm sure that
well, and I think that goes for you guys. You know, you're probably the point people testifying, but if you want a refresher, you're going into a hearing a year from now and you say, yeah, I know they did something about this. I can't remember why they did that. I would say pick up the phone and call any of us, because that's even though the committee's been discharged. Yeah.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Margaret.
Thank you, JD. I apologize for having to step in late, and not sure what precipitated the racial justice kind of conversation. Very much appreciate that we're at that place in this state where we can like take that head on. And at the same time, I feel like I would be remiss, and I think the committee would be remiss, if we didn't take an equal or close to equal look at disability access. People with disabilities have huge disparities in access. And there are land use parts to that, there are design parts to that, there are finance parts to that, there are building codes parts to that. And I just, since I found myself at a couple points in my earliest, some of my earliest recommendations that went in the pot were about disability access. I regret that I didn't lift those up sooner. But as we're talking about, you know, our wish list, I'm going to put disability access. And that's not just wheelchair ramps, that's universal design, that's people with hearing, you know, hearing and vision disabilities, that's people with intellectual disabilities. And so I don't want us to overlook that the disparities come in more flavors than race, and not to take anything away from the race part of the equation. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And I think just to answer the question, the comment kind of came up from like what in the next steps are happening, and making sure that we're really answering the charge of the governor's office, which was which included that lens of, you know, DEIG. So and I would even take that even a step further. There's economics, there's also geographic. There's a lot of other things that we need to make sure that we're kind of giving at least a little bit, or at least, you know, significant consideration to. Go ahead, Irene.
Thank you, JD and Chair Hall. I think I may have lost something in the translation of like what's our next steps, but I just want to say I appreciate the overview of where the governor's overview of how the governor's DEI team or equity team is going to come in and make sure that they apply a lens of equity and racial justice to make sure that that piece of the work is done in our recommendations. But I got a little overwhelmed thinking about how much work that we might be throwing towards Matthew and team to get everything that he needs to get done to get this to the finish line, to get to the governor. So I think I got lost in that piece of it. Can somebody just share again, like what's next for this group and what we need to do to get Matthew where he needs to go to get things to the governor's desk?
Yeah, let me just do the nuts and bolts. Ratify the recommendations today as they are. Provide any feedback about additional things that you'd like to see, and then show up to the next meeting. And in advance of the next meeting, the plan is to have a draft of the kind of compiled actual report, like the deliverable, and that you can review and then provide comments on that, comment. And then at the last meeting, we adopt the final report. That's the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about. And so, yeah, there's going to be a decent amount of work putting it all together, and then making it important, not just a list of recommendations, making it user friendly, organizing in a way that's user friendly. You know, things like I think the work group structure was very effective, but it may not be the way that the report is organized and things like that. There's a whole bunch of work to be done, and so thank you for calling that out, Ivory. But we're not asking this group, as a whole to do that work. All right, Natalie.
I just wanted to respond to a few things that were said, so bear with me if this is kind of jumbled, but in response to Margaret, for codes and design, we did have one, I know it's only one of 59, one recommendation geared towards disability access. In that process, we did have our SMEs, they did talk about intellectual disabilities, housing related, but it was too big of a topic to feel like we could really tackle in that recommendation. So it was discussed, but just because of the size of that lift, we just couldn't, we couldn't kind of formulate a good recommendation around it. So I just wanted to point that out. In response to what Daniel mentioned about, future consultation, I guess, about when recommendations move forward to legislature. One of my fears is that while the SOA forms did have a lot of information that went into them, the context of the whole conversation that went around the recommendation is kind of lost. And so some of these recommendations, while they might seem like small things, you know, like who cares about TIA recommendations, whatever, you know, like the context around it is so important. And I worry that context will make the recommendations seem small versus like, oh yeah, I'm just picking on finance because it's easy to do because of Daniel. But like, sure, having $150 million is a really good, that seems like it's going to fix a lot of problems. But like maybe with context, they would have a different flavor to them. So anyway, that's all my way of saying I agree with Daniel. If anyone, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about providing context. And that kind of leads into what Eric said. I like Eric's idea of maybe coming up with some kind of a prioritization, things that while they might seem small or whatever, would have a bigger impact that maybe the group sees because of that context that's not easily translatable into, you know, a written document. My fear with low-hanging fruit is always that's all that ever gets picked is the low-hanging fruit. Like that people pick the low-hanging fruit and they go, we did it, you know, there you go, you had your chance. And then the big things don't get tackled because you used up all of your will with the low-hanging fruit. So anyway, that was a lot. I'll stop now, but that was just some thoughts I was having.
All right.
Thank you, Natalie. I think that's a good point. I love the analogy. The low-hanging fruit analogies always bug me because the low-hanging fruit usually aren't the best fruit. You know, sometimes they're high in the tree and it takes a little bit more capital to get to. So I think that's going to be a good point. And maybe, and I'm just going off the cuff a little bit too, is the draft document that we hope to have ready for review in the January. I think there's still some work after that. I mean, either finalizing graphics, finalizing some text, you know, nothing really changing substantively. But I think one thing we might be able to do is be able to do maybe that pick out some of those kind of comments during that meeting or right before that meeting on the 17th that would then be incorporated into the executive summary from Damien and I. So maybe that's a way to kind of not only do kind of an analysis or like highlight of the pros, cons, or the ease or difficulty of attaining some of the recommendations, but then we can also then, like, you know, through text, like explain that in our executive summaries, like if these are things you really want to do, you know, this might be low hanging fruit, but a little bit more work, you can actually get this, you know, kind of a better fruit that's a little higher in the tree, and it's going to take a little bit more work, but it'll have a substantially more impact on the housing production. So I think there's some, you know, I think there's some opportunity to kind of really nail that story home in the executive summary. Representative Iverson.
Thank you. I am, I came into the group late, so I've been trying to kind of catch up and follow a lot of the conversation that's gone on previous to my joining the group this fall. And, you know, 59 recommendations that's a very robust conversation to be had, pushing it forward. I'm concerned about some of the things that in reading the recommendations that came to us just this last week, that it feels a little lopsided, and maybe this falls back to the conversation that I think Natalie just had, excuse me, that talked about, you know, we have in all the different subgroups have these robust conversations and then try to make light of them into one succinct document that everybody can work on moving forward. And it tends to maybe lend us towards looking at the low-hanging fruit, which, if we're honest, we've got to lean into if we're going to try to achieve a 36,000 additional units per year for the next 10 years. But I do also agree that it doesn't actually answer some of the bigger questions of how do we have a sustainable system moving forward for the state. And I feel like this is a bit lopsided. I actually, and I know that I was not part of one of the smaller work groups, but the financial recommendations there were some concerning things in there to me that I don't have a good answer. I'll be very upfront and honest about that. Anytime you try to generate more revenue out of the state, I get concerned. And I think that's real as we move this whole conversation forward through the legislature. As one of the electeds that's in this conversation, but also will be part of the conversation moving into the legislature as they look at some of these recommendations. I don't know how to back some of those things up. So I'm having some reservations there. And I'm putting this out there so you guys know where I'm coming from. I'm happy to have more conversations, but I think the whole of where everybody's at is important in this moving forward. So I do look forward to next steps. I'm glad to hear that we're not putting these recommendations forward in a somewhat of a vacuum, if you will, that there isn't more conversation or consideration to try to move some of the concepts forward. But I do feel like it's a bit lopsided to try to, and I think the senator touched on, how do we make an immediate impact, because a lot of the things we talk about are going to take ramp up time, and that's, if we want to be real about what we're trying to achieve, or what the governor made an executive order about and is trying to answer a question to, we've still got a gap in here of, I look at it in at least 2 years, and I don't think that's really the answer that we're trying to achieve here. So I think there has to be some low-hanging fruit that we pick, but there also has to be some ongoing things that we change in policy and procedures and law moving forward. So I'm all of that to say I'm still a little bit uncomfortable, guys. Thank you for letting me.
Well, thank you, Representative Reed-Sipson, and I appreciate that perspective. One of the things when I say user-friendly is that, you have the information, hopefully in this final report, to say, oh yeah, this will have an implementation period of X, Y, or Z, short, medium, or long term. So that if folks, want to lean into the things that are shorter term, medium term, and long term, that's probably what it takes to build something sustainable, but we can at least do that in an informed way. And then, yeah, very difficult to implement anything that, when I say short term, right, like 5 years for housing, because it takes 2 years to build it, right? So you got to create a policy, allocate the dollars, do the thing, implement, and then you can build the unit. So short term isn't even that short of a term when you talk about it in a state that thinks in biennium. So I think all of that is well said and part of the work of this committee. And I think what we can do and where our strength is to put that information there so that folks can have really informed discussions about sort of, hey, if we're doing the discussion about policy trade-offs, what are we actually getting for the state's money, and what are we getting for any given policy, and be as informed as possible when having that conversation. But yeah, no, I mean, it is going to be, and I think both you and Senator Anderson highlighted it, a big lift to get to both catching up to and sustaining the kind of deficit in housing that we've kind of dug ourselves into over decades. Daniel, go ahead.
I'd add on to that real quick. Is that, obviously we want to try and provide as much information as we possibly can, because again, these are recommendations that need to be picked up and carried by somebody else, whether that's a governor or, or handed down to the departments or even legislative actions. And so I do want to make sure that we're providing all the information we can, so somebody does, get inspired to pick it up and carry it, to the last 10 yards. And so providing any additional information, especially in the review of the final documentation, we really look forward to those kind of comments, is how to kind of make that justification more salient to individuals to pick that ball up and carry it. So I do look forward to that. But also, I think all of us, Daniel said this a little bit earlier, is that all of us have kind of committed our lives now to this in one way or another, that if ever anybody needs a reference or needs any kind of like a refresher on what a thought process was in a recommendation, whether it's in 6 months or in 6 years, I think, I'm still available. I'll always be around. But then not only us, but I think throughout this entire process, we've developed a large network of individuals throughout the departments as well as SMEs that have provided testimony and you know, good, bad, and otherwise, towards these recommendations. So I think we've kind of, if nothing else, I think this council has really kind of put a focus on housing and has really helped kind of, it'll really help kind of people focusing on that and to kind of be engaged on this process that might change some of that will or that political leveraging or whatever might need to happen in order to be able to get higher in the tree to get one of those, you know, sweeter fruits down and get some housing produced more quickly. Enough for my metaphors. Anyway, go ahead, Daniel.
I like your metaphors. I think Representative Reese Iverson raises a good point though about the balance, and just I just want to talk through. We did have to do some political triaging. I mean, I'm a conservative business owner. I mean, I don't like raising revenue. I can't believe I wrote the revenue recommendation. Really, I mean, if my friends and family knew about that, man, it would have been a horrible Christmas. But the calculus that led to that was, if the state's going to have mandates about all sorts of things, we have to fund getting them done. And our balancing test is, what's more likely, that the state voids the transportation planning rule, or that we raise revenue to build transportation at the local level? Maybe that's worth putting in somewhere. I don't know how you convey that in words, but that's part of that institutional knowledge of, you know, we've made some decisions in how we set up Oregon's government that the state issues edicts and local governments have to follow. And the odds of that changing, I think, are slim. Never say never, but that's Oregon's land use system. Is an order comes down from on high that you shall meet these level of service standards, or ODOT says, you're within a mile of an interchange. Guess what? Here's what you're doing. And if we're going to do that sorts of stuff as a state, then we have to fund it. And that's really where that recommendation comes from. We did not engage on the merits of, is it good to have a state government that tells local governments what to do? That's a great conversation. I would love to have that as a former city councilor. If anybody wants to hit me up on Zoom, call me and Riley. We've got lots of thoughts on it. But that's part of that, not reduced to writing kind of legislative history that's out of this group, is that we did have to make some very, very early on decisions about what was even feasible or practical when making recommendations to the governor. So I just want to put it on the record that we did go through those conversations, and I think I speak for the finance group, where we said, well, it's probably easier to raise revenue than to fundamentally alter Oregon's land use system or environmental regulation or a couple of other things. Not saying that there's not a meritorious policy debate to be had there, but being just very practical and cold and calculating about making recommendations to the governor. As distasteful as it might be, we think raising revenue is probably the path of least resistance. So I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but that's that history from the committee on that. And I don't know how to work that into the report, other than to say we're available to talk about it.
All right, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. You know, the whole kind of conversation about balance. You know, we do a lot of work across the state of Oregon. And, you know, one of the things that I hear very consistently in smaller communities, we've never gotten, you know, money for affordable housing, you know, the struggle for that, getting the money, you know, it is an issue. So when we talk about balance, you know, I keep thinking of balance across the state, you know, and what does that look like, and how we prioritize things. And I don't necessarily have the answer to that, but you know, part of this conversation about revenue and access to revenue is, you know, how do people obtain that revenue? You know, and that tends to be a part of the problem, especially in smaller communities where whether they don't have either local expertise or you know they just need to support it in that. But you know, so I'm hoping when we talk about, you know, balancing priorities, you know, there's really a thought about statewide what does this look like, and what are the things that we need to do to provide housing statewide in smaller communities? Because what happens is, we build kind of this process for people to, supposedly access dollars, but a lot of times the criteria cancels, agencies out, or communities out. I mean, so I don't know, again, necessarily, but when you again talk about balance, I just want to make sure that we're really talking about housing statewide and making it easier, especially for smaller communities, to develop.
Thank you, Robert. Ivory, you want to go ahead?
Ivory.
I just want to echo Daniel's comments and just say that what he said was a good example of why it took us so long to produce recommendations out of the Finance Committee, because we were really struggling with the history of how we've made decisions in the past. We were struggling with the political lens of our state government. What would be like low-hanging fruit, so to speak, what would be the path of least resistance. And so all of those things, it really, we were spinning there for a long time, because it was very difficult for us to get recommendations out. And so I think that some of us just really just took off our own perspectives of where we stand and how we think about the work of housing production, and started thinking about, like, what is it that we need to recommend that's bold, that's brave, that's innovative, that doesn't have anything to do with our history, but how can we move this process forward? So I just want to thank Daniel for stating that, because that kind of gave me the idea of that. That's why it took us so long to get recommendations out of the Finance Committee.
Appreciate your process. All right, Eric, go ahead, man.
Yeah, just to sort of reiterate my, I guess, to sort of break it down to my biggest fear is I could see 30% of these recommendations sort of being adopted and having a kind of a minor impact on housing and affordability, both production and affordability. And I could see 30% of the recommendations, if they were embraced and adopted, that they could have a huge impact. So my kind of underlying concern is, if we don't give some sort of direction as to at least our opinion of what those are, I fear we're going to end up potentially the potential for being disappointed at the end. So anyway, it's my fear.
Well, I appreciate you voicing that. I think we're going to do our best to get that into the report as far as what are the recommendations we think will have the biggest impact. A lot of it's going to be out of our hands. 30%. This is going back to kind of my planning education. If you do a huge comprehensive plan and 30% of it gets implemented, that's not a bad percentage, frankly. But that being said, right, like, I think going back to, we have the way that the issue's been framed and the task we've been given, does it get us to the 36,000 number? I think a lot has to be done to get us to that number. And I think, ultimately there's a whole bunch of factors that are outside of the recommendations and frankly outside of the powers of the state. There's a whole bunch of macroeconomic things that will just, ultimately kind of push the needle one way or the other on how successful that is, even if we implement all of these recommendations. So not to say that the work doesn't get us there, but I think your point is an important one. All these recommendations are important, but some of them will have bigger impacts. And then the point of Rob is important, that the impacts are going to be geographically disparate, and that's unavoidable as well. No matter what we do in this report, more units are going to be built in the Portland metro area than in other metro areas. But how do we, advance the amount of units that are being built in other metro areas that want that sort of growth? And so that, we have some sort of equity across the state where folks want it. And then, I think and also, the legislature is, by default and necessarily going to be doing the kind of analysis and triage of what can garner political support. It's just the nature of our system. So all those are going to get overlaid as far as the outcome of what advances and what doesn't. We are going to do an imperfect job of representing all of that in our report, but we're going to do our best. And I think I want folks to know that all of your points are well taken on that. So we're going to try and provide as much context. And I hear the offers to continue to provide refreshers on context in different settings going forward as these recommendations advance and sort of change, and making sure that folks know where the HPAC was coming from on any given recommendation. All right.
I like it. Natalie.
Sorry, just because apparently we're not done in my head. When you say, because you say we're going to put that in the report, like is this, just to be clear, is this fully reliant on the state economist's office to do that analysis? Because what I hear Eric saying is he would like for our group to have the input, and I agree. I feel like, I don't know if the solution is, everybody says their top 3 that they think would have the biggest impact, or I don't know, but where is that coming from?
So, I mean, if folks want to provide whatever input on what you think is the most important, feel free to go ahead and do that offline, and we can see who says what. But, I think what we're trying to get is a objective third-party analysis on what is going to actually have the largest impact on a recommendation by recommendation basis on housing production, because that's what we're talking about. That's it, right? So, and then all of the other layers that I just meant are going to impact the practicality. So us saying we really, really, really think this is great isn't going to change the political realities of the state. So let's just acknowledge that for a second, and us taking a vote on that is, not going to change that. So what we can do is give the decision makers and the elected officials say, hey, this recommendation, if you did it, it would create a whole lot of housing. And remember that a lot of the times there's going to be a whole lot of compromise in between what our report is and the recommendation and anything that actually becomes law. So, let's not get too, focused on and gripping, holding tight our favorite particular thing. Let's give some reliable information to the folks who are going to be making the decisions and doing the policy work. And that's what I would like to put into the report. So, that being said, if folks would like to put in, additional commentary, you've got the better part of a few weeks to draft whatever you want, whether that's, paragraphs about why any given recommendation is very important, or minority reports about why any given recommendation is impractical. Go for it. We will include that in an appendix, and we can compile that as well. But what we're looking at from the state economists really is about the things that they can credibly, tell us, and the information that we can, in a objective way provide to decision makers about if this were implemented, what do we feel with a level of certainty would be the housing production related impacts, high, medium, low, so that folks can compare the different recommendations and the efficacy of those. So, not wanting to open up any given number of debates and any given number of objectives and have that be the driving force of our report. We want to provide verifiable information that's couched in, the context of, what it is that has been our process, and not, I think, and let the folks take it from there, because like I said, there's a lot of layers to that the state economists can't, convey the entire picture by themselves. Our report can't convey the entire picture by itself. We will do as good a job of conveying the information that we've compiled as possible. But there's going to be a whole lot of discussions and a whole lot of compromise and a whole lot of Oregon politics in between our report and anything becoming a law. And, I think our role is to get that information to people so that they can have the conversations in a meaningful and technical way and not have it become this kind of binary, are we preserving a thing or are we developing a thing?
I also want to make sure that we're not putting forth if we do this one thing, it'll solve the problem. I mean, we're not creating a panacea. And I also want to make sure that that the interrelatedness of the recommendations is highlighted as well. We could drop $1 billion into new houses. Let's drop a whole bunch of money into new houses, but then we create a supply chain issue. And so that requires another solution to try to do that. But then we have a supply chain issue, but then we don't have enough people that are certified electricians. And so then that adds another timeline to the certain number of certified electricians, which goes into another recommendation on the, on some of the workforce development recommendations. But then we don't have enough people to actually get into that profession. So then it goes into a CTE thing with high school, which adds another 4 years. So if we focus on and say, do these two things, we could potentially actually create our own log jams because we didn't holistically look at all the other recommendations as well. And so I want to make sure that, obviously there's 2, 3, 5 things that it would just make a good impact. But we also have to think about the unintended consequences of even doing those, about creating our, downstream log jams. So I don't want to get hung up too much on saying, do this one thing or do these 3 things, because I think it could actually end up hindering us in some ways as well. We really have to think holistically, like if we're going to be increasing funding for homes or increasing funding into infrastructure, then what does that mean for supply chain? What does that mean for all the downstream issues? So I don't mean to, mollify this any, but I do want to make sure that we're kind of being holistic in these recommendations and not overly specific. Any other comments, questions? If not, I would jump back to the agenda, and our one agenda item really is to take a motion to ratify, let's see, what was, we have some draft language I think put together for this, to ratify the draft recommendations, 59 draft recommendations, to go forward into final documentation. Do you remember what we had a draft motion, Damien? Sorry, I'm completely.
Word for me. We'd accept the motion to ratify the preliminary recommendations.
Yep.
I move approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
Moved by Cody.
Hi, JD.
Seconded by Daniel. Any discussion on the motion on the floor? Hearing none, I'll turn over to Matt for a roll call vote.
Councilmember Bunn,
Yes.
Councilmember Flagon,
Yes.
Councilmember Gertler,
Yes.
Councilmember Olson,
Yes.
Councilmember Mills,
Yes.
Councilmember Matthews,
Yes.
Councilmember Madsen,
Yes.
Councilmember Wood,
Yes.
Councilmember Van Vliet,
Yes.
Councilmember Janney,
Yes.
Councilmember Hill,
Yes.
Councilmember Justice,
Yes.
Councilmember Cody,
Yes.
Senator Anderson,
Going to abstain simply because I'll be having to deal with this individually on the floor.
Representative Brees Iverson,
I will be abstaining as well, and much for the same reasons.
Co-Chair Hall,
Yes.
Co-Chair Tuvey.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Congratulations, everybody. Thank you for all that amazing work. We still got a lot more to do. This is just getting us to the starting blocks. So first of all, I just want to thank you all for your work and the enormous number of hours spent in work groups and working with SMEs to bring forth these recommendations. I think they are going to have some really good and positive impacts towards housing productivity in the state of Oregon. Damien, any comments or?
Just really thanks to everybody for getting in there and doing your level best and rolling up your sleeves and getting to work right away. It's been just a brief 9 or 10 months of hard work, and I really appreciate all of the time spent by folks on a volunteer basis putting together really what is a very substantive package of recommendations. You'll be seeing, I think, in the coming weeks what we can do to put that together as a final report. We look forward to your feedback on that. And Matt, do we have a date set or held tentatively for the final, everyone comes together with the final report in front of them meeting?
Yeah, thanks, Coach Hall. I'll just add my thanks as well. I know how much time everybody's put into this over the last 9 or 10 months and all the work groups and in between, particularly in the fall. I know it was a significant amount of work. So I'll share my appreciation and the governor's appreciation as well. As far as when the next meeting is, maybe it's just a good chance I'll just roll into next steps really quick. So we do have a calendar invite out for a next meeting. I believe the invite is for the 11th. I will just flag that it does conflict with interim legislative days, and so I think some of our elected officials are not available that day. So we are looking at the potential to move it by about a week, because of course we'd like to have the involvement of the senators and representatives on the council. I think our team's just confirming whether or not that will work. So just keep an eye out for that confirmation this week or early next week. And it would be an option for it'd be webinar for the public, and then an option to be in attendance virtually or in person in Salem. And then, I'll be working. I know some of the council members, you've volunteered to help in finalizing a report. I may not have gotten back to you yet. I appreciate that. I think for some of the other council members who have some key items they want to make sure are highlighted in the report in terms of key next steps or key priorities, please just email me. And I will be working with our team to get first a general outline of the components of what a final report would be. I'll share that out with the council soon, and then to fill in that content. And my hope is that we'll have all that content filled in by the next meeting, in that what is likely going to be the third week of January. There may be a couple of outstanding items of content, but hopefully we'll get it into a pretty final place by then. So that's next steps on my end.
Thank you so much, Matt. So look forward to some emails over the next couple of weeks as those documentation comes out. If anybody did volunteer to do a review, Damien and I are going to be doing quite a bit of review. Maybe we'll have a call or something in that time to kind of do any kind of once overs. So we'll be coordinating that. And then Matt, do you know about how much time or when the final confirmation will be to move that to the 17th or the following week?
I think likely it'll come early next week. We're just waiting to confirm with the legislative partners. This week, a lot of folks are out, so we may have to wait until the 2nd. I will do my best to get a confirmation out the 2nd or the 3rd.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other comments, questions from the group before we wrap up our day? A little bit early, I think. Margaret, go ahead.
I want to express my appreciation for the co-chairs and my colleagues and Matt, and it's been frustrating and hard and satisfying, and I want to just say good job, everybody. It's been a joy. There's a good, if the meeting, I'm out of the country the first half of January, so I'm hoping the delay happens and that I can be with you, but on the off chance I cannot, I just wanted to get in my word of appreciation and thanks and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Margaret. And also, because I don't think we said it expressly in this meeting, big shout out and huge thanks to all the staff that worked on this in the various departments and in the governor's office. You know, we spent a lot of hours. Y'all spent as much, if not more time, keeping us organized and on track in our process, and have played a huge part in, and will continue to play a huge part in compiling the final work product. So I want to thank y'all as well. And just generally, y'all have been a great group. It's not easy, doing most of this on Zoom with this many folks, and this many folks who are experts in their field. Y'all have done an amazing job, really kind of finding a path through and coming up with what I believe are a very substantive and potentially impactful set of recommendations. They give the state of Oregon a whole lot to work with about when figuring out just sort of what is, I see as the overarching question: what role does the state want to play in housing production? We've played a role in affordable housing production, and it's fairly limited in pass-through bonds and all that. But as the state looks to expand that, how does the state want to show up, and what are the options that it has? And I think we put forth a whole lot of options that, if policymakers are looking to get some traction and create some change and more housing, they have a good menu in front of them.
Well, thank you, everyone. Pending any other additional comments, I think we can probably adjourn for the day and give everybody an hour or so left to their day, and we'll see each other in January.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, folks. Take care.